and the entirety of my residual estate, including all properties, investments, and personal effects, I bequeath solely and unconditionally to my beloved daughter, Clara. The words hung in the air of that suffocating, tomb-like office. Clara. Me. Beside me, my stepmother, Lavinia, let out a strangled gasp, a sound like air escaping a punctured balloon. Her head whipped towards me, her eyes wide with a pure, unadulterated shock that quickly twisted her elegant features into something ugly, pure, boiling rage. She had been perched on the edge of an antique velvet chair, posture rigid, eyes previously fixed on Mr. Henderson, the lawyer, with a predatory gleam. Her perfectly manicured nails, blood-red that day, had been digging into the chair's arms. A vulture waiting to feast, I'd thought. Now she looked like the prey, suddenly realizing the trap had sprung. Seeing that look on her face, the utter disbelief, the dawning horror that her years of scheming had amounted to absolutely nothing, it was almost worth the hell she'd put me through. Almost. Because the price had been incredibly steep. My life hadn't always been this way, shrouded in tension and veiled cruelty. Before Lavinia slithered her way into our lives, things were simple, normal. I was just Clara, a young woman finding her way, living with a father I absolutely adored. My mom had passed away from a sudden illness when I was very young, leaving behind only hazy memories, faded photographs, and the warm stories my dad used to tell me about her kindness and her infectious laughter. But Dad, he was my constant, my anchor. My whole world. He was a good man, genuinely kind, perhaps a little too quick to see the good in people, a trait Lavinia would later exploit with ruthless precision. He'd built a successful tech consulting business from the ground up through sheer hard work and intelligence, but he never let it consume him. He always had time for me. Our home wasn't some sprawling mansion. It was a comfortable suburban house in a quiet neighborhood, filled with the scent of his terrible but enthusiastic weekend cooking, usually slightly burned pancakes or experimental casseroles. It echoed with the sounds of old movies we'd watch buried under quilts on the sofa, and the peals of laughter from our trips to the local park or the summer cottage by the lake he rented each year. He taught me how to change a tire, how to debate politics respectfully even when I was clearly wrong, how to appreciate the mournful sound of a saxophone in jazz music, and most importantly, he encouraged my passion for painting. He proudly displayed even my most abstract childhood creations, the ones that looked like colorful alien blobs, on his office wall. That was my foundation. A life built on unconditional love, unwavering stability, and the comforting, reliable presence of my father. I was in my final year of high school back then, neck-deep in college applications, dreaming about art school, navigating the usual teenage dramas with my friends. My world felt safe, predictable, a bubble of contentment. Dad had been alone for a long time, and while a selfish part of me loved having him all to myself, I knew he was lonely. He deserved companionship, happiness. So when he first brought Lavinia home, his face beaming, introducing her as someone truly special, I plastered on what I hoped was a welcoming smile and tried my absolute best to be open-minded. For his sake. He was striking. Tall, slender, with meticulously styled ash-blonde hair that never seemed to have a strand out of place, and clothes that spoke of quiet, expensive taste. Her smile seemed permanently affixed to her face, though it rarely seemed to ignite any genuine warmth in her piercing blue eyes. She told us she worked in high-end art curation, a convenient overlap with my own interests that she used initially to try and build rapport, asking about my favorite artists with feigned enthusiasm. She was incredibly adept at charming my father. She laughed at all his jokes, even the terrible puns he loved, hung on his every word about his business, praised his intellect, and made him feel like the most fascinating man in the world. He was completely smitten, visibly happier than I'd seen him in years. And because I loved him so dearly, I desperately wanted to believe her intentions were genuine. I actively suppressed my own creeping reservations. But even from that very first dinner, a tiny, insistent alarm bell sounded faintly in the back of my mind. Something felt, rehearsed about her affection, like an actress playing a part. There was a fleeting coolness in her eyes when she looked at me, especially when Dad's attention was momentarily elsewhere. A subtle possessiveness in the way she'd place her hand on his arm, staking her claim almost territorially. An almost imperceptible tension, a tightening around her lips, when I innocently mentioned my mother. I dismissed it as my own insecurity, maybe even a touch of petty jealousy that made me feel instantly guilty. I resolved to push past the unease, to embrace this new chapter for my father's happiness. Surely I was just being oversensitive. The wedding wasn't long after. It was an elegant, sophisticated affair. Lavinia's impeccable taste was evident in every detail, from the champagne flutes to the string quartet. And just like that, she wasn't just Dad's charming girlfriend anymore. She was Mrs. Thompson. She was moving into our house. My house. The house that held every tangible memory I had left of my mother, every echo of my childhood, every mark on the doorframe measuring my growth. And that's precisely when the carefully orchestrated disruptions began. Subtle at first, almost invisible, like ripples spreading from a stone dropped into the calm water of our lives. I remember the first incident with chilling clarity. It involved a small hand-painted ceramic vase, a little lopsided, that my mother had made in a pottery class years ago. It wasn't valuable in monetary terms, but it was precious to me, a tangible link to her. It always sat on the mantelpiece in the living room. One afternoon I came home from school to find it in pieces on the hearth rug, shattered beyond repair. Lavinia was standing nearby, holding a feather duster, an expression of theatrical dismay plastered on her face. "Oh, Clara, my dear, I am dreadfully sorry," she exclaimed, her voice dripping with faux sympathy as she knelt gracefully, pretending to be upset. She explained she was just giving the mantelpiece a thorough dusting. It was looking a bit neglected, you know, and her hand had slipped. "How utterly clumsy of me," she'd added with a little sigh. Her apology sounded plausible, almost convincing. My father, when I told him later, his voice laced with a sigh of his own, simply said accidents happen, that Lavinia felt terrible about it. He bought her performance completely. But as Lavinia carefully swept the broken shards into a dustpan, I caught a fleeting glimpse of something in her eyes, a tiny, almost imperceptible spark of satisfaction, quickly masked by her concerned frown. Or did I imagine it? That insidious doubt started to whisper in my ear again. Was I being overly sensitive? Was I projecting my own anxieties onto her? That's exactly what she wanted, I realize now. It was the first deliberate crack she made in the foundation of my secure world, and it left me feeling confused, unsettled, and starting to question my own perception of reality. The broken vase wasn't an isolated incident. It was the opening salvo in Lavinia's insidious campaign. Her strategy wasn't overt aggression, not yet. It was a campaign of subtle erosion, designed to chip away at my confidence, undermine my relationship with my father, and make me feel like an unwelcome, tolerated guest in my own home. It was psychological warfare disguised as domestic adjustment, death by 1,000 tiny cuts. Soon after moving in, she announced her plans to, in her words, refresh the house decor. My mother's comfortable, slightly worn floral armchair, my favorite spot for reading, vanished one afternoon. It was replaced by a stark, angular monstrosity in gray leather that looked like it belonged in a modern art gallery waiting room, cold and uninviting. Photographs of my mom, which had always dotted the living room and hallways, smiling down from various frames, were gradually relocated. First to less prominent side tables, then grouped together on a single obscure shelf in the study, and finally, packed away into a box labeled Sentimental Items Storage, that Lavinia tucked away in the dimmest corner of the attic. When I gathered the courage to ask why, my voice small and hesitant, she'd affect an air of gentle reasoning. "Clara, darling," she'd said, "we need to create a space that feels like ours now, a blend of styles. A fresh start for this new chapter of our family," she chirped. My father, eager to avoid conflict and genuinely believing she meant well, would usually back her up, gently chiding me to be more accepting of the changes. He simply couldn't see the deliberate, systematic erasure of my mother's memory, and by extension my past. Then came the interference with my social life. Plans I'd made weeks in advance with my friends, like movie nights or sleepovers, would suddenly clash with a mandatory family dinner Lavinia had arranged with her friends, people I didn't know and who looked through me. Or an impromptu weekend trip she insisted Dad needed for relaxation, and of course I had to come along dragging my feet. Important calls from friends on the landline. This was just before cell phones became ubiquitous for teenagers, would sometimes get mysteriously disconnected, or messages wouldn't be passed on. "Oh, was that call for you, dear?" she'd say with perfect innocence. The line must have crackled, I couldn't hear properly. School assignments I'd diligently completed and left on the kitchen counter to grab in the morning would occasionally go missing. Later, I might find them crumpled at the bottom of the recycling bin, buried under newspapers. "Goodness me," Lavinia would sigh dramatically, "I must have mistaken that pile for scrap paper during my tidying blitz. So terribly sorry." She became a master of the passive-aggressive comment, the compliment laced with poison. "That dress is an interesting choice, Clara." "Very bold," she'd remark, her tone making it clear she found it hideous. Or after I excitedly shared news of winning a school art prize. "Oh, that's lovely, dear. It's wonderful you have hobbies to keep you occupied." Each remark was a tiny dart, aimed to prick my confidence, to make me feel small and insignificant, but always delivered with that bright, fixed smile that dared me to call her out and look like the ungrateful, overly sensitive teenager she was painting me to be. Gradually, she inserted herself as the manager of my father's life, becoming the gatekeeper to his time and attention. Our easy, spontaneous father-daughter moments, grabbing pizza on a whim, tinkering with his old car in the garage, even just talking quietly about our days, became increasingly difficult to schedule. "Your father had a very demanding week, Clara," she'd inform me smoothly, intercepting my attempts to connect with him when he got home from work. "He really needs to de-stress this weekend. Perhaps another time." But another time rarely materialized. Behind closed doors, I knew she was subtly poisoning his perception of me. I once overheard her talking to him in low, concerned tones drifting from their bedroom, saying I seemed so moody lately that she thought I was struggling to accept her, and she worried I was pulling away from him. She skillfully framed my reactions to her own provocations as evidence of my difficult nature, all while positioning herself as the patient, loving stepmother just trying her best against unreasonable adolescent resentment. I started to feel increasingly isolated, adrift in my own home. The frustration was immense, a constant knot in my stomach. I knew what she was doing, the deliberate pattern behind the accidents and misunderstandings, but proving it felt impossible. Every time I tried to voice my concerns to Dad, carefully choosing my words, Lavinia would materialize as if summoned, ready with a perfectly plausible explanation, a counter-narrative that painted me as mistaken or malicious. She'd deploy tears of hurt innocence with Oscar-worthy timing, express profound disappointment at my inability to bond, making me look like the villain. Dad, desperate for peace in his new marriage, blinded by the charm she still laid on thick for him, inevitably urged me to make more of an effort, to give Lavinia a chance. The distance between my father and me wasn't just growing. It felt like Lavinia was actively digging a trench between us, wider and deeper each day. The initial vague unease had solidified into a constant state of anxiety and a profound sense of injustice. Something was terribly wrong, and the woman responsible wore the mask of an angel while wielding the tools of a saboteur. I felt utterly alone, trapped in a nightmare she was carefully constructing around me. The transition wasn't like a sudden storm. It was more like the slow, creeping chill of winter setting in, each day a little colder, a little darker. Lavinia's cruelty, once veiled and plausibly deniable, began to shed its disguise, particularly when my father wasn't present. The need for pretense seemed to lessen as her confidence in her control over the household, and by extension over my father's perceptions, grew stronger. My 17th birthday marked a noticeable escalation. I'd expressed a simple wish: dinner at my favorite cozy Italian restaurant with Dad and maybe 2 close friends. Lavinia overheard and immediately took charge with a bright, brittle smile. "Nonsense, Clara," she announced at breakfast. "A young lady's 17th requires something more memorable. I'm planning a lovely garden party. Just some sophisticated finger foods and mingling." Naturally, mingling meant her circle of friends and business contacts, people I didn't know and who had zero interest in me, their eyes skimming past me as if I were part of the scenery. My friends were explicitly not included. It's really more of an adult affair, darling, she explained to Dad later, framing it as a grown-up treat for me. The party itself was excruciating. I felt like a show pony, paraded around in a stiff, uncomfortable dress she'd picked out. Much more suitable, she declared, dismissing my own choice with a wave of her hand, forced to exchange strained pleasantries with her smirking friends whose perfume hung heavy in the air. When I tried to escape the suffocating small talk and slip inside, Lavinia intercepted me by the French doors, her smile tight, her voice a low hiss that no one else could hear. Don't you dare embarrass your father or me by sulking, Clara. Go back out there, smile, and act like you appreciate the effort I've put into this. The mask wasn't just slipping anymore. She'd ripped it off and stomped on it, revealing the cold tyrant beneath. From then on, her criticisms became relentless, a constant barrage aimed at my self-worth. My academic achievements were met with faint praise followed by a "but could you do better if you applied yourself more?" My choice of university course, art history, was impractical. My artwork was derivative. My friends were a bad influence, not ambitious enough. My posture needed correcting. My eating habits were scrutinized at every meal. It was a never-ending stream of negativity, delivered with a condescending smile designed to grind me down, to make me feel utterly inadequate. Control tightened like a vice. My part-time job earnings, saved meticulously for college supplies, suddenly had to go into a joint account for budgeting purposes, which meant she monitored every penny I spent, questioning every small purchase. Use of the family car became a privilege granted or withheld based on her whim, often dependent on completing arbitrary chores to her impossible standards, like reorganizing the linen closet until every towel was folded with military precision. She even accidentally shredded a crucial financial aid form for college, a form I'd left carefully on Dad's desk for his signature, forcing me into a panicked scramble to get a replacement before the deadline. She offered a flimsy apology later about mistaking it for junk mail, her eyes devoid of any real remorse. The gaslighting reached new heights. Objects I distinctly remembered placing somewhere, my keys, my phone, a specific textbook needed for an exam, would vanish, only for her to find them later in an obvious place, tooting about my forgetfulness and how I'd lose my head if it wasn't attached. She would flatly deny conversations, agreements, or permissions given just days or even hours before. "Claire, you must be dreaming." I would never have said that, she'd state with absolute certainty, looking me directly in the eye, making me second-guess my own sanity. It was a calculated campaign to destabilize me, to make me appear unreliable and confused to my father and anyone else who might listen. Desperate, I made one last major attempt to break through to my father. I compiled a list, specific dates and incidents, trying to show him the pattern, the calculated nature of her actions. I poured my heart out, tears streaming down my face, begging him to just listen, to see what was happening, to see the woman behind the mask. It backfired spectacularly. Lavinia walked in, seemingly by chance, her timing impeccable, catching the tail end of my impassioned plea. She immediately burst into tears, claiming she felt so attacked, so unappreciated, despite trying so hard to be a good stepmother. She accused me of trying to drive a wedge between her and Dad, of being jealous and resentful of their happiness. Overwhelmed, exhausted by the constant drama she created, Dad shut down. "Clara," he said, his voice heavy with weariness, his shoulders slumped, "I can't do this anymore. You two need to find a way to coexist peacefully. Please just try." It was a devastating blow. He wasn't just choosing not to see. He was actively choosing her narrative over mine, choosing the path of least resistance. It was around this deeply painful time that Lavinia's focus on finances became impossible to ignore. It wasn't just idle curiosity anymore. It was an obsession. I saw her taking hushed calls with investment brokers when Dad was out, her voice low and urgent. I found printouts of his stock portfolio hidden under magazines in her study, marked up with her notes. Once, late at night, I saw a light on in Dad's home office and peeked in to find her at his computer, her face illuminated by the glow of the screen, clicking rapidly through pages that looked suspiciously like online banking portals. She minimized them instantly when she sensed my presence, whirling around with a startled, guilty look before composing herself into a serene smile. "Just paying some bills online for your father, dear," she'd said smoothly. "He finds all that digital stuff so confusing." A chilling realization dawned, cold and hard in the pit of my stomach. This wasn't just about power dynamics or petty cruelty anymore. This was about the money. My father was a wealthy man, his business incredibly successful. Was that the endgame all along? Was her systematic campaign against me simply about eliminating the competition, clearing the path to his fortune? Was I just an inconvenient heir, a potential drain on the inheritance she saw as rightfully hers? The thought was sickening, but it explained everything. The charm offensive towards Dad, the relentless undermining of me, the calculated isolation. I wasn't just fighting for emotional survival anymore. I was potentially up against a gold digger of the highest, most ruthless order. I knew with absolute certainty that I couldn't just endure this passively. I had to find proof. I had to protect myself, and somehow, I had to protect my father's legacy from her greedy clutches before it was too late. The fight had just become far more serious, far more dangerous. The following years were a tightrope walk of survival. Going away to college provided crucial physical distance, a buffer zone from Lavinia's daily onslaught. University life was my escape, a place where I could finally breathe, focus on my art, make genuine friends who saw me for who I was, and start painstakingly rebuilding the sense of self Lavinia had worked so hard to dismantle. However, the tether remained. She insisted on weekly calls, her voice dripping with faux maternal concern, skillfully extracting information about my life while offering veiled criticisms about my choices. "My major, art history," she'd sigh. "Are you sure that's practical, dear, for a career?" "My friends," she'd inquire, "do they share your family's values?" My plans for the future, she'd gently probe. "Shouldn't you be aiming higher? Perhaps something in finance like your father?" Visits home for holidays were fraught with tension, carefully stage-managed events where I felt like an outsider performing a required role in a play I hadn't auditioned for. My relationship with my father existed in this strained limbo. We spoke on the phone, exchanged emails, but the easy intimacy, the shared jokes, the deep connection we once had, it was buried under layers of Lavinia's influence and his own weary avoidance of conflict. He'd ask about my studies in a detached way, tell me superficial news from home, but there was always an invisible barrier, a reluctance to delve deeper, perhaps for fear of upsetting the fragile peace Lavinia enforced with an iron will. It broke my heart piece by piece, but I clung to the hope that someday, somehow, he might see the truth. Then, roughly 6 months before the will reading, the news came like a physical blow. Dad was sick. It started insidiously, persistent fatigue he couldn't shake, unexplained weight loss, symptoms that initially baffled doctors until a grim diagnosis was finally made. Lavinia, predictably, stepped into the role of the devoted, self-sacrificing caregiver with an unnerving, almost theatrical relish. She managed his appointments, relayed medical information, often filtered, I suspected, and increasingly controlled who could visit and when. "He needs absolute rest and quiet," she'd tell me firmly over the phone, her tone implying my very presence would be disruptive. "I'll let you know when it's a good time for him to have visitors." I refused to be kept away. I drove home on weekends, often showing up unannounced to bypass her gatekeeping. Seeing Dad was shocking each time. The vibrant, energetic man I knew was fading before my eyes. He seemed diminished, frail, his once sharp mind clouded by pain and the haze of strong medication. Lavinia hovered constantly, a shadow at his bedside, monitoring our conversations, steering them towards neutral, meaningless topics, often cutting my visits short with excuses about his need for rest or strict medication schedules. But during one visit I found a rare moment alone with him. Lavinia had stepped out to, as she put it, consult with the nurse about his dietary needs. Dad's eyes, heavy-lidded moments before, suddenly focused on me with startling intensity. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and gripped mine with surprising strength. His voice was barely a whisper, rough and weak but urgent. "Clara," he rasped, his eyes darting towards the closed door and back to me. "Listen to me. Be careful. Watch her. Don't trust everything she says or does." A chill snaked down my spine, cold and sharp. He knew. Or at least he suspected. Had he overheard something? Seen a mask slip when she thought he was asleep? Finally connected the dots I'd so desperately tried to show him years ago? My mind raced. What didn't he trust? What had he seen? Before I could formulate a question, the door swung open and Lavinia re-entered, carrying a glass of water, her caregiver smile firmly back in place. "Here we are, darling," she cooed to Dad, patting his hand. The moment shattered. But his words burned into my memory. "Be careful. Watch her." Dad's health continued its relentless decline. It was agonizing to witness his suffering, made worse by Lavinia's suffocating control over his final months. She presented herself to the world as the grieving, dutiful wife, always composed, always solicitous. But Dad's whispered warning had changed everything for me. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was a dying man's plea. A confirmation. Grief warred with a cold, burgeoning resolve. After Dad passed, the world tilted on its axis. The pain was immense, a hollow ache that seemed to fill every space, every silence. Lavinia, however, moved through the initial motions of grief with chilling efficiency before quickly shifting her focus. Within days, she was talking about contacting real estate agents, mentioning sensible downsizing, her eyes holding a barely concealed gleam of avarice. She treated me with a kind of condescending sympathy, like I was an inconvenient piece of baggage she'd soon be free of, a loose end to be tidied up. She clearly believed she had won, that the prize she'd coveted for so long was finally within her grasp. She had absolutely no inkling of the bombshell my father had secretly, meticulously prepared. The day of the will reading felt heavy, ominous. Back in Mr. Henderson's imposing wood-paneled office, the air thick with unspoken tension. Mr. Henderson, Dad's lawyer for over 30 years, a man of quiet dignity, looked somber but resolute. Lavinia sat ramrod straight beside me, emanating an aura of triumphant anticipation. She probably envisioned a scenario where she inherited the vast majority, perhaps with a token trust fund set up for me, easily contestable later if she so chose. Mr. Henderson began reading, his voice steady and clear. He detailed minor bequests, some family heirlooms to distant cousins, donations to Dad's favorite charities. Lavinia shifted impatiently in her seat, her gaze fixed on the lawyer, waiting for the main event, the disposition of the real assets. Then Mr. Henderson paused significantly. He took off his glasses, polished them slowly with a silk handkerchief, and then looked directly, pointedly at me. "And now," he announced, his voice gaining weight, "we address the final codicil to the will. This addition was executed by Mr. Thompson 3 months before his death." Beside me, Lavinia went utterly still. Her head turned slightly, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. "A codicil," she murmured, her voice tight with sudden suspicion. Clearly, this was not part of her plan. "Indeed," Mr. Henderson confirmed, meeting her gaze briefly before continuing. "It reads as follows. Having become aware, through direct observation and reflection, of circumstances concerning the treatment of my beloved daughter, Clara, which caused me profound distress and regret, and recognizing that my previous testamentary intentions no longer align with my true wishes or serve her best interests, I hereby explicitly revoke all prior clauses related to the disposition of my primary estate assets." Lavinia made a small, sharp sound like a gasp being strangled. Her perfectly manicured hand flew to her throat, her knuckles white. The lawyer continued, his voice clear and unwavering, each word a hammer blow to her ambitions, I imagined. "My paramount concern now, as always, is the future security and happiness of my only child. Therefore, despite any previous statements or documents, I direct the following. The entirety of my residual estate, including but not limited to the family residence located at our current address, all stock portfolios, investment accounts, business interests, and all personal property contained therein, I bequeath solely, unconditionally, and irrevocably to my daughter, Clara Thompson. Solely, unconditionally, and irrevocably to my daughter, Clara Thompson. Me." The words hung in the air, heavy and final, echoing slightly in the quiet room. Mr. Henderson placed the document carefully on the desk. "There is one further item," he added, his gaze shifting to Lavinia, who looked like she'd been turned to stone, her face a mask of disbelief. Your late husband left a personal sealed letter addressed specifically to you, Lavinia. His instructions were clear that it was to be given to you only after the formal reading of this codicil. He picked up a thick cream envelope from the desk and slid it across the polished surface towards her. My father had seen. He had understood. Maybe it was that desperate whisper in the hospital. Maybe it was years of small observations finally clicking into place, forming an undeniable pattern. Maybe Lavinia, confident in his decline and her ultimate victory, had let her mask slip one too many times. Whatever the catalyst, he had recognized the truth of her. The manipulation, the avarice, the chilling lack of genuine affection beneath the polished facade. And in his final months, despite his illness, despite the pain, he had found the strength to act decisively, to protect me, to ensure the fruits of his life's work didn't fall into the hands of the woman who had caused us both so much pain. This wasn't just about inheriting wealth. It was about inheriting the truth. It was his final, powerful affirmation. I see you. I believe you. I've got you. Tears welled in my eyes, blurring the imposing figure of the lawyer, but they weren't just tears of sorrow. They were tears of profound relief, of vindication, of a daughter finally, fully seen by her father. The twist wasn't merely the inheritance. It was the revelation of his final, clear-eyed act of love and protection. The silence that fell in Mr. Henderson's office was absolute, heavy enough to feel physical pressing down. You could practically hear the gears grinding in Lavinia's head as she tried to process the unthinkable. Her face, just moments before radiating confident expectation, had drained of all color, leaving her expensive makeup standing out like a garish mask on chalky skin. Her mouth worked silently, opening and closing like a fish out of water, but no sound emerged. Her carefully constructed world had just imploded spectacularly. What did you say?" she finally managed, her voice thin and reedy, almost unrecognizable, a pale imitation of her usual commanding tone. "That's impossible. There's clearly been some kind of error. Charles wouldn't, he promised me." Mr. Henderson leaned forward slightly, his expression firm but professional. "There is no error, Lavinia, I assure you. The codicil is legally watertight, signed by Mr. Thompson in my presence, with 2 independent witnesses, all confirming his soundness of mind at the time. His instructions were explicit and unequivocal." Lavinia's head snapped towards me, her eyes, moments ago wide with shock, now narrowed into slits burning with pure, unadulterated fury. "You," she spat, her voice regaining its sharp edge laced with venom. "This is your doing. You twisted his mind against me. You took advantage of a sick, dying man whispering your poison." I felt a surprising surge of calm amidst the emotional storm. Years of being silenced, of having my reality denied, seemed to fall away. I didn't need to scream or defend myself. The truth was right there, documented, undeniable. My father's final act was my defense. "He knew the truth, Lavinia," I said, my voice steady, meeting her hateful glare without flinching. "He finally saw who you really were, what you really wanted." "Lies. All lies," she shrieked, losing control completely, her facade crumbling. She brought her fist down hard on the mahogany table, making a heavy paperweight jump and rattle. "He adored me. We were devoted. This is fraud. I demand to see his previous will. I'll contest this. I'll drag you through every court in the state." Mr. Henderson held up a calming hand, though his eyes remained stern. "Lavinia, while you have the right to seek legal counsel, I must strongly advise you against pursuing a contest. The evidence supporting your late husband's final wishes is substantial." He was quite specific in his reasoning, which he detailed in accompanying notes provided to me. He nodded towards the sealed envelope lying untouched before her. "Perhaps the letter he wrote to you personally will provide illumination." With trembling hands, Lavinia snatched the envelope. She ripped it open with savage force, her eyes darting furiously across the handwritten page within. I watched as her expression shifted rapidly, disbelief warring with incandescent rage, then morphing into a kind of sputtering impotence as she read my father's final words to her. I could only imagine what he'd written, perhaps outlining the moments he'd witnessed her cruelty, the realization of her financial motives, his deep disappointment and disgust. Suddenly, she crushed the letter into a tight ball in her fist, her face contorted with a terrifying blend of fury and desperation. "This means nothing," she snarled, her voice thick with rage. He wasn't in his right mind. He was drugged, confused. She probably wrote this herself and forged his signature. "That is a baseless and offensive accusation, Lavinia," Mr. Henderson interjected sharply, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I personally witnessed the signing, as did my associate and Mr. Thompson's physician. His competence was beyond question. The codicil stands. Clara inherits the entirety of the residual estate. That is the final legal reality." Lavinia shoved her chair back violently, scraping it loudly across the floorboards as she surged to her feet. She glared around the room, her chest heaving, searching for some purchase, some ally, but finding only the lawyer's unwavering gaze and my quiet presence. Her eyes finally locked back onto mine, filled with a chilling, spiteful promise. "You think this is over," she hissed, leaning towards me menacingly. "You haven't won anything. You'll live to regret this day, you manipulative little viper." Then, drawing herself up with the last vestiges of her shattered pride, she spun on her heel and stormed out of the office. The heavy door slammed shut behind her with a resounding boom that echoed in the sudden, profound quiet. The silence lingered, thick with the residue of her toxic presence. Mr. Henderson let out a long, slow breath and sank back in his chair slightly. He looked over at me, his professional demeanor softening into something kinder, almost paternal. "Your father, Clara, he was adamant about this. He expressed considerable remorse that he hadn't acted sooner to protect you." A single tear finally escaped, tracing a hot path down my cheek. It wasn't a tear for Lavinia or her shattered greed. It was for my father, for the lost years, for the pain he'd unknowingly enabled, but ultimately for the fierce, protective love that had finally cut through the deception. The vast fortune was almost incidental at that moment. The true inheritance, the priceless gift, was the validation, the knowledge that he had seen me, believed me, and done everything in his power to make things right. The heavy weight of Lavinia's oppression, the constant anxiety, the feeling of being small and unseen, it began to dissipate, replaced by the first tentative rays of peace I'd felt in years. The real payoff wasn't the money. It was the reclaiming of my life, my past, and my future from the woman who had tried so desperately to steal them all. The immediate aftermath was predictably turbulent, yet ultimately futile for Lavinia. Fueled by rage and desperation, she hired an aggressive lawyer and promptly filed a suit to contest the will's codicil. She threw every accusation imaginable at the wall: claims of my father's dementia, allegations of undue influence on my part, even bizarre suggestions that Mr. Henderson and I had somehow conspired against her from the start. It was ugly, stressful, and dragged on for a few grueling months, forcing me to revisit painful memories and steel myself against her venom. However, my father and Mr. Henderson had built an ironclad case. Medical records unequivocally proved Dad's mental competence in his final months. Signed affidavits from the witnesses, including his longtime physician, confirmed the circumstances of the signing with irrefutable detail. And then there was Dad's letter to Lavinia, alongside his detailed notes to Mr. Henderson explaining his reasoning. These painted a clear, damning picture of her behavior and motivations throughout their marriage. Her lawsuit was built on bluster and lies, a desperate gamble, and it quickly collapsed under the weight of the evidence. The judge dismissed her case firmly, even hinting at potential sanctions for filing a frivolous lawsuit, a clear rebuke of her tactics. Facing the prospect of crippling legal fees she could no longer afford, having apparently lived lavishly assuming the inheritance was hers for the taking, Lavinia was forced to abandon the fight. The last concrete news I had, relayed through a mutual acquaintance, was that she'd sold off her expensive jewelry, vacated the luxury apartment she'd rented after leaving Dad's house, which was now legally mine, and moved several states away to live with a reluctant distant relative, her tail between her legs. Her fall from grace was swift and total. Stripped of the wealth, status, and influence she had schemed for years to obtain, she simply disappeared from my life. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just a quiet, ignominious fade out into obscurity. For me, stepping into my inheritance felt overwhelming at first. The sheer scale of it was hard to comprehend, the numbers on paper seeming unreal. But more profound was the feeling of reclaiming my space, both literally and figuratively. Walking into the house Dad and I had shared, the house Lavinia had tried to remake in her cold, sterile image, was initially strange, almost like visiting a museum of a painful past. But slowly, piece by piece, I began to undo her changes. Her stark, modern furniture went out. Warmth and comfort came back in. I unpacked the boxes of my mother's belongings from the attic, carefully placing her photos and her handmade vase, while a similar one I found at an antique shop, its spirit the same, back where they belonged. Painting the walls in colors I loved, choosing new, soft curtains, filling the rooms with the jazz music Dad used to play. Each act felt like healing, like breathing life back into a space that had been suffocated for too long. The fortune provides security, of course. It means I don't have to worry about student loans or finding immediate work just to pay the bills. It offers freedom and opportunities, the very things Lavinia worked so hard to limit for me. I finished my art history degree not because I needed to for a career, but because I wanted to for myself. I've set up a proper art studio in one of the spare rooms, filled with natural light, canvases of all sizes, and the rich smell of oil paints. A dream Dad always supported with unwavering enthusiasm. I'm planning a trip to Florence next year, to see the masterpieces we talked about, something he and I had always dreamed of but never managed. Eventually, I think I'll establish a small art scholarship fund in my parents' names, to help other young artists pursue their passions. The money isn't the point. It's the tool that allows me to build the life Lavinia tried to prevent, a life based on passion, peace, and purpose. Grief remains, a quiet undercurrent, a gentle ache. I miss my father terribly, especially the man he was before Lavinia clouded his judgment and heart. I mourn the lost years, the fractured connection, the conversations we'll never have. But overshadowing the sadness is a deep, abiding gratitude for his final act of clarity and courage. He didn't just leave me his wealth. He left me his trust, his validation, his ultimate protection. Those years under Lavinia's thumb were a crucible, a trial by fire. They taught me painful lessons about manipulation, greed, and the insidious nature of psychological abuse. But surviving it forged a resilience I never knew I had. It taught me the vital importance of trusting my own intuition even when the world, or one very manipulative person, is trying to convince you you're wrong, that you're imagining things. And it showed me that sometimes, the most satisfying justice isn't about revenge in the traditional sense of inflicting pain, but about reclaiming your own narrative, your own happiness. Seeing Lavinia reduced to nothing provided a certain grim satisfaction, I won't deny it. But the real victory, the ultimate revenge, is living a full, joyful, creative life, completely free from her shadow and her influence. Thriving. And that is exactly what I wake up determined to do every single day.